The boardroom fell silent as I slid the termination letter across the polished mahogany table. Mark Holloway stared at the document, his face draining of color as he recognized the familiar letterhead, the same template he'd used to fire me 6 months earlier. Only this time my signature graced the bottom line. "You can clear your desk by the end of the day," I said, my voice steady despite the thundering in my chest. "Security will escort you out." The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one had expected this, least of all Mark, whose manicured fingers now trembled against the paper. "This is a mistake," he whispered, looking around the table for allies. Finding none, I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice low enough that only he could hear me. "You were right about one thing, Mark. Everyone is replaceable." His eyes met mine, recognition dawning as the words he'd once thrown at me returned like a boomerang. 6 months ago, he told me I was replaceable while handing me a cardboard box for my belongings. Today, I signed his termination letter as the new CEO of Holden and Price Innovations. But what he didn't know was that I never wanted revenge. I wanted him to feel small, the way I did when he took everything I built and claimed it as his own. My name is Danielle Rivers. And this is how I turned Betrayal into an empire. I was always the first to arrive and the last to leave. For 5 years, I built my life around Holden and Price Innovations, a mid-sized tech consulting firm in Chicago's River North district. The kind of place where ambition hung in the air like expensive cologne, where handshakes sealed deals and whispers broke careers. I started as a systems analyst, fresh out of Northwestern with a double major in computer science and business. Nothing about me screamed, "Future CO." I was quiet, methodical, the woman who took notes in meetings while others talked over each other. The one who fixed problems without demanding credit. My apartment was a small one-bedroom in Wicker Park. Nothing fancy, just enough space for me and my rescue cat, Pixel. I didn't drive a luxury car or wear designer clothes. My splurges were books and late-night Thai food when coding kept me up past midnight. Simple dreams, simple life. Or so it seemed. What no one at Holden and Price knew was that beneath my unassuming exterior, I'd been building something of my own. During weekends and late nights, I developed a proprietary analytics system I called Rivers Analytics, named after my grandfather who taught me that true power lies in patience. The system could predict market shifts and optimize resource allocation with unprecedented accuracy. I registered it under a private LLC, a small act of self-protection in an industry where ideas were currency and theft was common practice. Mark Holloway became my direct supervisor during my 2nd year. He was everything I wasn't: loud, charismatic, politically savvy. The kind of man who commanded attention when he entered a room, who played golf with executives and knew the names of their children. "You're my right hand, Danielle," he'd say, clapping my shoulder as he reviewed my work. "We're going places together." I believed him. That was my first mistake. When the government announced a $20 million contract opportunity for a new resource management system, Mark put me in charge of the proposal. The project, code-named Argonne, would revolutionize how federal agencies allocated funding across departments. "This is your chance to shine," he told me, eyes gleaming with ambition. "If this goes through, that promotion is yours." For 3 months I lived and breathed Argonne. I skipped family gatherings, canceled dates, and worked through weekends. My desk became a nest of coffee cups and takeout containers. I built the entire proposal on my Rivers Analytics framework, customizing it specifically for government infrastructure. The night before the presentation, Mark stopped by my desk at 11 p.m. I was still fine-tuning the slides, my eyes burning from staring at screens all day. "Go home, Danielle," he said, his voice unusually gentle. "You've done enough. I'll handle the final touches." I hesitated, protective of my creation. "I can stay. I don't mind." "That's why you're invaluable," he replied, smiling. "But trust me. Get some rest. Tomorrow's the big day." I handed over my flash drive, containing weeks of work and years of my private research. As I gathered my things, he added, "By the way, the executives want to keep the presentation team small. Just senior leadership in the room. But you can watch from the side. It's politics, you know how it is. But don't worry. Your name is all over this proposal. I nodded, too tired to argue. I believed loyalty was currency, until I realized I was the one being traded. The morning of the Argonne presentation dawned bright and cold, one of those crisp Chicago autumn days when the lake glitters like broken glass and the sky stretches endlessly blue. I dressed carefully in a charcoal pencil skirt and burgundy blouse, my small attempt at standing out while still fitting in. The boardroom at Halden & Price was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River, a table of polished walnut that seated 20, and chairs that cost more than my monthly rent. By 8:30 a.m., it had filled with executives in tailored suits, government representatives with stern expressions, and Mark, resplendent in navy blue, his confidence radiating like heat. I slipped in quietly, taking a seat along the wall with the other non-essential staff. Mark caught my eye and gave me a quick thumbs up before turning his attention to the CEO, James Halden, who was making introductions. Today's presentation, Halden announced, represents months of innovative work by our team, spearheaded by our Director of Operations, Mark Holloway. My heart stuttered. Spearheaded. I gripped my portfolio tighter, telling myself it was just corporate speak. Of course they'd mention my contribution when they got to the technical details. Mark stood, buttoning his jacket with practiced ease. Thank you, James. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the tremendous opportunity the federal government has provided with this initiative. He turned to the presentation screen and my blood froze. The title slide had been changed. Where it once read Project Argonne, developed by Danielle Rivers, systems architect, it now simply stated Project Argonne, Halden & Price Innovations. My name erased. The Argonne system, Mark continued, his voice confident and smooth, represents a paradigm shift in resource allocation methodology. I've developed a proprietary algorithm that predicts utilization patterns with 98.7% accuracy. I've developed 2 words that severed my connection to months of work. 2 words that stole my intellectual property. 2 words that revealed Mark Holloway for exactly who he was. I sat motionless as he walked the room through my slides, my research, my ideas, all presented as his brilliant innovation. He used my exact phrases, my analogies, even the small jokes I'd embedded to make dense material more accessible. The beauty of this system, he said, gesturing to a complex flowchart I'd created at 3 a.m. one desperate Tuesday, is its adaptive learning capability. It's something I've been conceptualizing for years. My concept. My capability. A government official leaned forward, clearly impressed. This is remarkable work, Mr. Holloway. The integration of predictive analytics with resource allocation is exactly what we've been looking for. Mark smiled, that practiced, perfect smile that never quite reached his eyes. When you've been in this field as long as I have, you develop an intuition for these solutions. The room nodded appreciatively. I felt sick, my skin too tight, the air too thin. I wanted to stand up, to shout, to reclaim what was mine. But the words stuck in my throat, trapped by years of conditioning to be professional, to not make waves, to handle things through proper channels. The presentation concluded with enthusiastic handshakes and promises of follow-up meetings. No one looked my way. No one remembered I existed. I was invisible, a ghost haunting the periphery of my own creation. As the room emptied, I approached Mark, my hands trembling slightly. You didn't mention my contribution, I said quietly, careful to keep accusation from my tone. He glanced around to ensure no one was within earshot. Politics, Danielle. You understand. The government wants to deal with senior leadership. Mentioning a systems analyst would only complicate things. But the entire system is built on my framework. The algorithm is. Our framework, he corrected, his smile tightening. Halden & Price's intellectual property, developed while you were on company time. That's how this works. You promised me credit. The promotion. And you'll get it, he interrupted, checking his watch. Once the contract is secured. Trust the process, Danielle. I haven't forgotten your contribution. But he had. Or rather, he'd remembered it perfectly, and claimed it as his own. 2 weeks later, the news broke. Holden and Price had secured the $20 million Argonne contract. The company newsletter featured Mark's photo on the front page, hailing him as a visionary. My name appeared nowhere. That same afternoon, his assistant called me. Mark would like to see you in his office. I walked down the hallway with my heart in my throat, telling myself this was it. The recognition, the promotion, the moment when things would be set right. Mark's office occupied the corner of the 15th floor, with views of both the river and the lake. He sat behind his desk, reviewing documents, and didn't look up when I entered. "Close the door, please," he said. I did, then took a seat across from him. On his desk sat a framed photo from the contract signing ceremony. Mark shaking hands with a government official, both smiling broadly. Finally, he looked up and slid a folder toward me. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news, Danielle." Opened it. Inside was a termination letter. "Budget cuts," he explained, leaning back in his chair with that smug half-smile I'd come to recognize as his tell, the expression that emerged when he was lying. "Don't take it personally. You're talented, Danielle. You'll land on your feet. We all move on eventually." The room tilted slightly. "Budget cuts. We just secured a $20 million contract, which requires restructuring our team. We're bringing in specialized government liaison personnel. Unfortunately, that means eliminating some existing positions." "My position," I clarified, my voice hollow. "These decisions are never easy," he said, not sounding remotely troubled. "HR has prepared a severance package. 2 weeks' pay, standard confidentiality agreements. 2 weeks. For 5 years of my life." I stared at him, searching for any hint of the mentor he'd pretended to be, any flicker of recognition for what he was throwing away. Finding nothing. Then, almost like he couldn't resist twisting the knife, he added, "You're replaceable, Danielle. Everyone is." I stood, the termination letter clutched in my hand. "Is there anything else?" He seemed surprised by my calm. Perhaps he'd expected tears, pleading, anger, some emotional display he could later describe to colleagues as unprofessional. "Security will escort you to clear your desk," he said, already turning his attention back to his computer. "Standard protocol." I walked out without another word, holding my cardboard box, my last paycheck, and my dignity, the only thing he hadn't stolen. As the security guard watched me pack my personal items, colleagues averted their eyes. Some whispered behind cupped hands. A few sent sympathetic glances. No one spoke to me directly. By noon, I was standing on the sidewalk outside the building I'd entered before sunrise for 5 years, holding a box containing a plant, a coffee mug, and a framed photo of my parents. But what Mark didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the Argonne project he'd stolen from me was built on a system I had quietly developed under my private LLC. The core algorithm, the heart of what made Argonne revolutionary, belonged to Rivers Analytics. It wasn't illegal. I'd been careful about that. I'd used my personal framework as a foundation, then built the government-specific application on top of it during company time. Holden and Price owned the application. I owned the foundation. As I hailed a cab in the autumn sunshine, a strange calm settled over me. Mark was right about one thing: I was replaceable. But not by him. The first week after being fired, I did what most people do. I fell apart. My apartment became a nest of takeout containers and unwashed coffee mugs. I cycled through streaming services in a blur of background noise. Pixel, my cat, watched with increasing concern as I wore the same sweatpants for 3 days straight. On day 8, my phone rang. My mother calling from Minneapolis. "Danielle, are you coming for Thanksgiving next week?" I'd forgotten about the holiday entirely. "I'm not sure, Mom. Things are complicated right now." "What's wrong? You sound terrible." I hadn't told my family about losing my job. Saying it aloud would make it real in a way I wasn't ready to face. But something about my mother's voice, steady, familiar, broke the dam. "I got fired," I said, the words scraping my throat. "Mark took credit for my project and then let me go." Silence stretched across the line. Then, "That snake," she said with such venom that I almost laughed. "Your father always said he looked shifty in the company photos. Dad's never even met him. He has good instincts about people." He paused. "Come home for Thanksgiving, Danielle. Clear your head." I started to refuse, then stopped. What was keeping me in Chicago? Job interviews could wait a week. "Okay," I said. "I'll drive up Tuesday." That decision, small, simple, became the first step in my transformation. At my parents' dining table, surrounded by the familiar chaos of family, my father asked the question that would change everything. "So what are you going to do about it?" Not "how will you find another job?" or "have you filed for unemployment?" but "what are you going to do about it?" As if the situation demanded action rather than acceptance. "What can I do?" I replied, pushing mashed potatoes around my plate. "He has the company behind him. I'm just me." My father, a retired mechanical engineer who'd spent 40 years solving problems, set down his fork. "Danielle Elizabeth Rivers, you've never been just anything in your life." That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at my childhood desk, opened my laptop and began to research. Not job listings but Holden and Price's corporate structure. Their subsidiaries. Their investors. Their weaknesses. I discovered they'd been quietly struggling before the Argonne contract. 3 failed product launches had made shareholders nervous. Their stock had dipped 12% over the previous quarter. The government contract was their lifeline, and it was built on my stolen work. By dawn, I had the beginnings of a plan. I returned to Chicago with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. First, I found a small studio apartment in Lincoln Park, cheaper than my previous place, with just enough room for me and Pixel. I took freelance coding contracts to pay the bills, working remotely for startups that couldn't afford to care about my sudden departure from Holden and Price. But my real work happened after hours. I reached out to Eli Matthews, a college friend who'd gone into investment banking and had a reputation for orchestrating corporate takeovers. We hadn't spoken in years, but he agreed to meet for drinks at a quiet bar in the West Loop. "Danielle Rivers," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. "Still the smartest person I know." I smiled despite myself. Apparently not smart enough to avoid getting screwed over. I told him everything: the project, the theft, the firing. By the time I finished, his expression had shifted from sympathy to something sharper, more calculating. "You know," he said, swirling his whiskey, "most people would just sue for wrongful termination." "I don't want a settlement," I replied. "I want what's mine." He studied me for a long moment. "You don't need to get even, Danielle. You just need to get smart." Over the next 3 hours, Eli outlined a strategy so audacious it should have terrified me. Instead, I felt a cold fire ignite in my chest, determination crystallizing into purpose. The next morning, we formed Rivers Equity Partners, a holding company with me as the primary shareholder and Eli as the strategic advisor. Our first move was subtle, purchasing a small, struggling software firm that Holden and Price had acquired years ago and subsequently neglected. The acquisition barely made the business news. Just another tech reshuffling in a city full of startups and failures. No one at Holden and Price would notice or care that their castoff had found a new home. But it gave me access to their internal systems. A small, legitimate window into their operations. Meanwhile, I refined my Rivers analytics system, enhancing its capabilities beyond what I'd incorporated into Argonne. If Mark wanted to claim my past work, fine. I would build something better, something he couldn't touch. I cut my hair. The long brown waves I'd maintained since college now fell in a sharp bob that framed my face with new angles. I invested in a wardrobe that commanded attention rather than deflected it. Structured blazers, tailored pants, shoes that announced my arrival. The woman who stared back from the mirror was a stranger. Harder, more focused, with eyes that calculated rather than hoped. "Good," I whispered to my reflection. He won't see you coming. 6 months is nothing in the corporate world. A fiscal quarter and a half, barely time for strategies to unfold. But when you're burning with purpose, 6 months can change everything. While Mark basked in his stolen success, I moved like water, finding every crack in his foundation, every weakness in his empire. Through Rivers Equity Partners, I began acquiring small tech subsidiaries that Halden and Price had neglected. Companies they'd purchased for specific technologies, then left to wither once they'd extracted what they needed. I bought them at bargain prices, revitalized their operations, and connected them under my growing network. Each acquisition gave me more insight into Halden and Price's operations, client lists, vendor relationships, internal protocols. I wasn't breaking any laws. I was simply becoming a legitimate business competitor with unusual insight into their vulnerabilities. 3 months after my firing, I received a text from my former colleague, Vivian Chen. "Did you hear about the Argonne launch? Complete disaster. Government threatening to pull out." I hadn't heard. I'd been too focused on my own plans. But a quick search confirmed it. The implementation of Argonne was failing spectacularly. System crashes, data inconsistencies, resource allocations that made no sense. Because Mark didn't understand the foundation of what he'd stolen. He could present my work, but he couldn't maintain it or adapt it when problems arose. That night I called Eli. "We need to accelerate the timeline." "What's changed?" he asked. "Argonne is failing. The government might pull the contract." Silence stretched across the line as he considered the implications. "If they lose that contract, Halden and Price stock will plummet." "Exactly. And we need to be positioned to capitalize on that." The next day, Rivers Equity Partners made its boldest move yet. We purchased a 7% stake in Halden and Price through a series of shell companies and blind trusts. Not enough to control anything, but enough to gain access to shareholder meetings and financial reports. Meanwhile, I reached out to an old contact at the Federal Oversight Committee, someone I'd worked with on previous government projects before Argonne. "The system is fundamentally flawed," I explained over coffee, careful to maintain a professional tone rather than a vindictive one. "The algorithm requires continuous adjustment based on usage patterns. Without that maintenance, it will continue to degrade." Holloway assured us his team could handle any issues. My contact replied, frowning. "Mark Holloway is an excellent salesman," I said. "But he's not the architect of that system." I didn't explicitly state that I was. I didn't have to. The implication hung in the air between us. "The government has already invested millions," he said, his expression troubled. "We can't just pull out." "Of course not. But you might consider an independent audit. To protect your investment." 2 weeks later, the Federal Oversight Committee announced an independent audit of the Argonne implementation. Halden and Price's stock dropped 8% on the news. By this point, through various entities, Rivers Equity Partners owned 23% of Halden and Price. Not enough for control, but enough to be the largest single shareholder after the founding partners. Then came the twist of fate I'd been waiting for. The audit revealed critical flaws in the Argonne implementation. Flaws that could be traced directly to modifications made after the initial design. Modifications ordered by Mark Holloway, who didn't understand the system's architecture but insisted on changes to make it more efficient. The government pulled the contract, citing breach of performance guarantees. Halden and Price's stock plummeted 32% in a single day. Shareholders demanded answers. The board called an emergency meeting. And Rivers Equity Partners revealed itself as the company's largest outside investor. Eli represented our interests at the shareholder meeting, a strategic decision to keep my involvement hidden until the perfect moment. He painted a compelling picture: a company in crisis, leadership that had failed, and a need for immediate intervention to salvage shareholder value. Rivers Equity Partners is prepared to inject significant capital to stabilize operations, he told the board. But we require changes in executive leadership as a condition of our investment. The board, desperate to stop the bleeding, agreed to review candidates for interim CEO. They expected Eli to propose himself or some corporate turnaround specialist from his network. Instead, he submitted a single name: Danielle Rivers. Ms. Rivers has intimate knowledge of Holden and Price's operations and, more importantly, understands the technical foundation of the Argonne system, which, despite its current implementation issues, remains a valuable intellectual property asset. The board was skeptical, of course. They'd never heard of me beyond my role as a former systems analyst. But when Eli revealed that I was the original architect of the Rivers analytics system, the foundation upon which Argonne was built, their attention sharpened. "You're saying she created the core technology?" James Holden asked, leaning forward. "I'm saying," Eli replied carefully, "that Rivers Analytics LLC holds the patent on the core algorithm that powers Argonne. An algorithm that was licensed to Holden and Price through Ms. Rivers' employment, but remains her intellectual property." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Without me, they couldn't salvage Argonne. Without Argonne, they couldn't recover their largest contract and restore shareholder confidence. 24 hours later, I received the call I'd been waiting for. The board wanted to meet with me immediately. As I prepared for the meeting that would change everything, I received one more text from Vivian. "Mark's freaking out. Board's been in emergency sessions all day. What's happening?" I didn't reply. She'd find out soon enough. By the time he realized who owned the algorithm, I already owned his company. 6 months to the day after Mark Holloway fired me, I walked through the revolving doors of Holden and Price Innovations. The security guard at the front desk, the same one who had escorted me out with my cardboard box, did a double take as I approached. I wore a charcoal suit with a blood-red silk blouse, my new bob sleek and precise, my heels clicking against the marble floor with metronome precision. "Ms. Rivers," he said, confusion evident in his voice. "I'll need to call upstairs," I finished for him, offering a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "James Holden is expecting me." His phone call confirmed it, and moments later I was in the elevator, ascending to the executive floor, a space I'd visited only a handful of times during my 5 years with the company. The board was assembled in the main conference room, 8 men and 2 women in expensive suits, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and desperation. James Holden rose as I entered, extending his hand. "Ms. Rivers, thank you for coming on such short notice." I shook his hand firmly. "Mr. Holden, I understand time is of the essence." The meeting lasted 2 hours. I presented my analysis of Holden and Price's current situation: the stock freefall, the lost government contract, the technical failures of Argonne under its current management. Then I outlined my proposal: a complete restructuring with me as CEO, a technical overhaul of Argonne based on the original Rivers analytics framework, and a strategic pivot to rebuild government trust. "This is comprehensive," Holden said when I finished, glancing at his fellow board members. "But I have to ask, why would you want to return to a company that terminated your employment?" I met his gaze steadily. "I'm not returning to anything, Mr. Holden. I'm creating something new from what remains." After a brief discussion, they asked me to step outside while they deliberated. I waited in the hallway, watching employees hurry past, some recognizing me with startled expressions, others oblivious to the power shift occurring behind closed doors. 20 minutes later, Holden opened the door. "We'd like to move forward with your proposal, Ms. Rivers. There are details to work out, but in principle we're aligned." I nodded, maintaining my composure despite the victory surging through me. "When would you like me to start?" "Immediately," he replied. "Today if possible. The markets need a signal that change is coming." "Then I'll need to speak with Mark Holloway," I said. "Alone?" Holden hesitated, then nodded. "He's in his office. I'll have my assistant bring the paperwork there for signatures." The walk to Mark's office was the longest and shortest of my life, each step bringing me closer to the moment I'd envisioned for 6 months, yet happening so quickly it felt dreamlike. His door was closed. I knocked once, then entered without waiting for a response. Mark was on the phone, his back to the door, staring out at the Chicago skyline. I don't care what the technical team says, he was saying, his voice tight with stress. Tell them to fix it or find new jobs. He turned at the sound of the door, irritation flashing across his face. Then recognition. Then confusion. I'll call you back, he said into the phone, setting it down slowly. Danielle, what are you doing here? Closed the door behind me. Hello, Mark. He recovered quickly, professional smile sliding into place. This is unexpected. If you're here about your old position, I'm afraid that's been filled, but I could put in a word with HR about other openings. That won't be necessary, I replied, moving to sit in one of the chairs across from his desk. I'm not here for my old job. Wariness crept into his expression. Then why? A knock at the door interrupted him. Halden's assistant entered with a folder of documents, which she placed on Mark's desk with a murmured, "The board needs these signed immediately, Mr. Holloway." After she left, Mark opened the folder. I watched as he scanned the first page, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally dawning horror. "This is a joke," he said, looking up at me. "It has to be." "The board doesn't seem to think so," I replied calmly. "They've approved the restructuring plan. Effective immediately." Restructuring. He flipped through more pages, his movements becoming frantic. "This isn't restructuring. This is a change in leadership," I supplied. "The board feels the company needs a new direction after the Argonne failure." His face flushed. Argonne didn't fail. There were implementation issues that stemmed from fundamental misunderstandings of the core algorithm, I finished for him. An algorithm you claimed to have developed but couldn't actually maintain. The boardroom fell silent as I slid the termination letter across the polished mahogany table. Mark stared at the document, his face draining of color as he recognized the familiar letterhead, the same template he'd used to fire me 6 months earlier. Only this time my signature graced the bottom line. "You can clear your desk by the end of the day," I said, my voice steady despite the thundering in my chest. "Security will escort you out." The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one had expected this, least of all Mark, whose manicured fingers now trembled against the paper. "This is a mistake," he whispered, looking around the table for allies. Finding none, I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice low enough that only he could hear me. "You were right about one thing, Mark. Everyone is replaceable." His eyes met mine, recognition dawning as the words he'd once thrown at me returned like a boomerang. "How?" he managed, the single word containing volumes of disbelief. "Rivers Equity Partners," I said simply. "My holding company. We've been acquiring shares for months. The board was quite receptive to our investment offer, with conditions, of course." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "You're Rivers Equity. But that's impossible. You couldn't have the capital to buy enough shares to become the largest stakeholder." Smiled. "You'd be surprised what you can accomplish when you own the intellectual property behind a $20 million government contract. The Rivers Analytics System," he breathed, finally connecting the dots. "You registered it privately. Before I ever joined Halden and Price," I confirmed. "You stole the application, Mark. But I owned the foundation." He stood abruptly, anger replacing shock. "This won't stand. I'll fight this. The board can't just." "The board already has," I interrupted, my voice hardening. "Unanimously. You've cost this company millions in market value and destroyed its most valuable contract. Your options are to leave quietly with a standard severance package or contest this and face a very public examination of your role in the Argonne failure." I stood smoothing my jacket. "Your choice, of course. But I'd recommend taking the severance. It's 2 weeks' pay, standard for budget cuts, I believe." The color drained from his face as I threw his own words back at him. "You're talented, Mark," I added, moving toward the door. "You'll land on your feet. We all move on eventually." As I reached for the handle, he called after me, his voice hoarse. "Was this your plan all along? Even when you were working here. I turned back, considering him one last time, the man who had taken everything from me and expected me to disappear. No, Mark. This became my plan the moment you taught me what happens to people who trust instead of verify. Pause. Good luck out there. You're replaceable after all. The news broke the next morning. Holden and Price names new CEO amid restructuring. Business channels buzzed with speculation about the unknown systems architect, who had ascended to the top position. Financial analysts debated whether I could salvage the company's plummeting stock price. I didn't give interviews. I didn't need to explain myself to the world. Instead, I focused on rebuilding what Mark had broken. My first official act as CEO was to rehire 3 talented engineers who had been let go during Mark's budget cuts, people whose only crime had been loyalty to me. My second was to establish a clear attribution policy for all intellectual property developed within the company. Within a month, we had stabilized the Argonne system and reopened negotiations with the government. Within 3, our stock had recovered 60% of its losses. By the 6-month mark, Holden and Price, soon to be renamed Rivers Innovation Group, was stronger than it had ever been under previous leadership. I kept Mark's corner office but redecorated it completely, replacing the dark woods and leather with clean lines and natural light. No trace of him remained. One evening, as I worked late reviewing quarterly projections, Vivian knocked on my open door. "Still can't believe you pulled this off," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "Half the company thought you'd disappeared for good." I smiled, setting down my pen. "That was the point. Have you heard what happened to Mark?" she asked, her expression curious. I hadn't kept tabs on him after his departure. His fate no longer interested me. Should I have? He tried to get a position at Meridian Financial. They turned him down after checking references. She raised an eyebrow. Apparently someone told them about his history of taking credit for other people's work. "How unfortunate for him," I replied, my tone neutral. Vivian studied me for a moment. Was it worth it? All of this, the months of planning, buying the company, taking his job. I considered her question carefully, looking out at the Chicago skyline glittering in the evening light. The same view Mark had enjoyed while plotting my removal. "This wasn't about taking his job, Vivian," I said finally. "It was about creating something he couldn't steal." After she left, I walked to the window, watching the city lights reflect off the river below. People think revenge is about destruction, tearing down what hurt you. But real revenge, lasting revenge, is about creation, building something stronger from the ashes of betrayal. I didn't ruin Mark Holloway. I replaced him. I built a company where his type of theft couldn't flourish, where attribution mattered, where talent was recognized regardless of title or tenure. As I turned back to my desk, my eye caught the small framed quote I'd placed there on my first day as CEO. Words my father had said to me over Thanksgiving dinner when I was at my lowest. "You've never been just anything in your life." Mark built his kingdom on my silence. I built mine on his downfall. And unlike him, I made sure my foundation was unshakable. They say success is the best revenge. But that's not quite right. Success isn't revenge. It's redemption. It's the proof that what was broken in you wasn't your talent or your worth, but only your trust in the wrong people. When Mark fired me, he thought he was writing the end of my story. What he didn't realize was that he was only providing the inciting incident, the catalyst that would transform me from a supporting character into the protagonist of my own narrative. I didn't destroy Mark because I couldn't forgive him. I replaced him because I couldn't allow his version of leadership, built on theft and betrayal, to become the standard for success. This was my revenge. Not out of hate but out of memory. The memory of who I was before he tried to erase me, and the vision of who I could become once I stopped making myself small to accommodate others' ambitions. Tell me, have you ever been betrayed by someone who smiled while doing it? What would you have done in my place? This is Boundless Revenge, where silence becomes strategy and pain turns into poetry. Subscribe before the next twist catches you off guard. Have you ever noticed how the people who take credit for your work are always the first to call you replaceable? As if your ideas are valuable enough to steal, but you yourself are disposable. The most dangerous person in any room isn't the one with the most power. It's the one who's been underestimated, watching and learning from the shadows. What would you have done if you were me? Would you have walked away and started fresh somewhere else? Or would you have calculated every move like I did? Drop a justice in the comments if you think Mark got what he deserved. Many of you have asked what happened to the other executives who stood by while Mark took credit for my work. Did they keep their positions under my leadership? That story is coming next week. And let's just say loyalty matters more than titles in my company. We've all had our work stolen at some point. The colleague who repeats your idea louder in meetings, the boss who presents your proposal as their own. But we're not victims here. We're the ones who learn to protect our brilliance. If you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or had your work stolen, subscribe now. Because in this community we don't just survive betrayal, we use it as fuel to build something they can never take away. Don't miss next week's confession. It might just change how you protect your ideas forever. Imagine spending years making yourself smaller to fit someone else's idea of your place, only to discover that your greatest power comes from standing at your full height. That transformation lives in all of us, and these stories show you how to find it. Remember, when they call you replaceable, they've already shown you exactly where to strike.